So you're going to see a couple of common themes today. One is, the major one really is taking control away from, you're welcome, taking control away from the what? Nobility, right? Taking control away from the aristocracy and giving it to who? Right? Well, they're giving it to the middle class, but for the purpose of strengthening the monarchy, right? That's the whole goal of the monarchy, is to make themselves stronger. Do you think that they would give power to the middle class if it didn't make them stronger? No, this is all about getting control for themselves, and we're going to see this as we continue throughout history, and we talk about the French Revolution and Louis XIV and all that kind of stuff, and how monarchy is just going to get out of control. Okay, so that's the whole purpose, really, of this section, is just displaying how the monarchy took power, okay, and how the nobility lost power, and why the nobility lost power. Because if we look at it, right, we've been going through what? What's this whole chapter about, for the most part? Renaissance, right? A rebirth. But before this, how was life? It was crappy, right? We had the Black Plague, and we're going to talk about the Black Plague a little bit. We had the Hundred Years' War, but there weren't standing armies in countries before this, right? So when a war happened, who fought? Who owned the armies? The nobility, the lords, right? The aristocracy did. They are the only ones that had the money who could afford it. Then we talked about this before. So if you were a soldier, if you will, and you were fighting, you were not loyal to France. You were not loyal to England. You were loyal to the guy that was feeding you or giving you weapons or writing your paycheck, right? So that's going to change. That's going to be probably one of the biggest things that we see change, is a sense of nationalism, having national standing armies, and a unity coming together in most all of Europe, except for really Spain. Okay, and Italy. Italy doesn't do such a good job of it right away either. Okay, any questions? All right. Work for me. There we go. So what we're doing today, trace the evolution of the nation states of Western Europe during this period. How did the nation states of Western Europe evolve in this period? We'll answer these questions today. Some vocab for you. Did I leave the vocab in the slides for you guys? Oh man, I done messed up. So a Yorkist is simply someone from York. Lancastrian is someone from Lancaster, which is what we're going to talk about when we talk about the War of Roses today. Tudor is a long line of kings from England. If you haven't heard of the Tudors, the Tudors, yeah, it's a series about. Actually, I've never seen it though. Maybe I should watch. Maybe we should all binge watch. Is it called the Tudors? Yeah. Maybe we should all just binge watch the Tudors throughout. How many series is it? We can make it happen, and then maybe we would understand European history better. Who cares about that? Reconquista or reconquest. We're going to talk about that in Spain, as well as the Inquisition, a period of prolonged and intensive questioning or investigation is what an Inquisition is, mainly against the Jews. So no, World War II wasn't the first time somebody hated on the Jews. Intro 434. Mason, do it for me. Very good, sir.
against opposition, especially from the love the business of kingship and power.
Very good, sir. So really, what this whole section isn't about isn't necessarily taking power away from the or from the nobles, but more about giving power to the monarchs. Okay. So the Hundred Years' War. First, we're going to talk about France. The Hundred Years' War left France in shambles. We had 100 years of warring. Again, it was nobility fighting nobility. It wasn't state against state. We had a civil war going on between two different areas, if you will, two different provinces for quite a while. France was drastically depopulated, commercially ruined, and agriculturally weak, as you can imagine if people are trouncing around your countryside, warring all the time. So we have Charles VII, who revives the monarchy in France, and he actually did a pretty good job, nothing too terrible. He didn't ruin France. He brought it back to life, and then Louis XIV is going to ruin it. But he reconciled the Burgundians and the Armagnacs, who had been waging civil war for 30 years, long time, expelled the English from France, except for Calais, which is the very north, right across the English Channel from England. Reorganized the Royal Council, giving increased influence to the middle class men. And again, this isn't necessarily to this does twofold for the king. So many of the people that are oppressed, especially during the Hundred Years' War, are the middle class, if you will, the merchants, the guilds. They're oppressed by the nobility. So not only that, but they are in greater number than the nobility. So if the king turns around and gives middle class men more rights, or makes them a part of what am I looking for? Makes them a part of government. I forget what the group is called in France. They have a greater majority. They have a greater population, so they are going to be more pro the king than the nobility will be, because the nobility have the same goal as the king. And what's the goal of the nobility? Power. Right? They've been in power forever, and they don't want to lose that to one overarching monarch. But these kings are pretty smart, especially Charles VII, in that they're giving power to the middle class, cutting out the nobility, and now the majority has more power than the minority of the nobles. Okay, so pretty smart. He also strengthened royal finances through such taxes as the salt tax and the land tax. And we've talked about these before. There's the Duchy of Aquitaine. You just see how split up France was, the different houses. So by establishing regular companies of cavalry and archers recruited, paid, and inspected by the state being France, Charles created the first permanent royal army, which is a big deal. We hadn't seen this before. Like I mentioned, armies were ran, funded, fed by nobles. In 1438, he also published the Pragmatic Sanction of the Borgias, giving power of general council over the papacy. This is a big deal. This is a huge deal, really. He's saying that he has more power than the Pope over the church in France. Okay? As you can imagine, that's going to cause some issues, but it actually came out pretty diplomatically, which unfortunately things were too often diplomatic in the church and not about actually the church or its people. So the Pragmatic Sanctions gave the French crown major control over the appointment of the bishops and deprived the Pope of French ecclesiastical income. So basically, he had appointment over the bishops, meaning he had appointment over those individuals and therefore had control over the message that was being given. Also, he was able to, instead of a lot of the money from the French church going to the Pope, it would then go to the king. Okay, greater control over the church and army helped consolidate the authority of the French crown. This is one way that he was able to afford his own national army, because a lot of the money that helped pay for that was money that was now going to him instead of to the Pope. Charles's son, Louis XI, was very much a Renaissance prince. Facing the problems of chaos in the feudal order, he used investments as a solution. Louis promoted new industries like silk weaving, welcomed foreign craftsmen, and entered into commercial treaties with England and Portugal, used revenues and severe taxation to improve the army. And several events led to the expansion of his kingdom. So if you'll turn to page 435, I'll just read a short excerpt explaining all of that. It's just easier than me restating it all. So 435, left column, second paragraph, starting with Luck favored. Luck favored his goal of expanding royal authority and unifying the kingdom. On the timely death of Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy in 1477, Louis invaded Burgundy and gained some territories. So he joined Burgundy. 3 years later, the extinction of the House of Anjou brought Louis and the counties of Anjou, Bar, Maine, and Provence together. So he's consolidating the country, unifying the country of France and all these different provinces. Two further developments strengthened the French monarchy. The marriage of Louis XII and Anne of Brittany added the large western duchy of Brittany to the state. Then the French King Francis I and Pope Leo X reached a mutually satisfactory agreement in 1516. The new treaty, the Concordat of Bologna, rescinded the pragmatic sanctions, so removed the sanctions of the pragmatic sanctions of the Borgias that we just talked about, asserting the superiority of the General Council over the papacy, and approved the Pope's right to receive the first year's income of new bishops and abbots. In return, Leo X recognized the French rulers' right to select French bishops and abbots. French kings thereafter effectively controlled the appointment and thus the policies of the church officials in the kingdom. So all of that to say, all those different territories, Anjou, Maine, Bar, Provence, Burgundy, Brittany, all came under unity under the French crown. They were all united. On top of that, the papacy and the French king worked out a deal. They did away with the pragmatic sanctions, and the Pope got the first year's salary of abbots or bishops, and the French king was still allowed to decide to choose who was going to be in the clergy. Got it? Questions? Anybody care? All right, moving on. In England, aristocracy dominated the government. Surprise, surprise, it did it everywhere. Of Henry IV, and indulged in mischievous violence at the local level. That is the aristocracy. Between 1455 and 1471, the ducal houses of Lancaster and York waged civil war in England. This is known to be the War of Roses because one house had a red rose on its flag and one house had a white rose on its flag. This hurt trade, agriculture, and the domestic industry. And under Henry VI, the authority of the monarchy sank lower than it had been in centuries. Yorkist Edward IV began establishing domestic tranquility. He beat the Lancastrian forces. After 471, began to reconstruct the monarchy. His brother Richard III and Henry VII worked to restore local royal prestige and to crush the power of the nobility. All three rulers used methods that Machiavelli would have supported of ruthlessness, efficiency, and secrecy. Secrecy being important, and that instead of really promoting the middle class like France did, they kept their politics to a tight-knit, close circle of like 10 to 15 guys. The 100 Years' War was financed by Parliament. As long as the monarchy was dependent on the Lords and Commons for revenue, the king had to call Parliament. Because Parliament is made up of who? Aristocrats, right? We have the House of Commons and we have the House of Lords. House of Lords being the nobles, the aristocrats, House of Commons being common people. The English monarchy started mending foreign relations and thus avoided expensive wars and did not depend on Parliament for money, therefore canceling out aristocratic influence. So that was pretty smart. Instead of giving power to the middle class, they didn't need the money of the aristocrats as much anymore because they weren't warring and therefore didn't need to call Parliament and therefore were able to make up their own rules. Everybody understand that? Tracking on that? Okay. Henry VII made the center of royal authority the Royal Council, which governed at the national level. And this is where that secrecy comes in. Not everybody, this wasn't a huge group of people. This wasn't like Parliament. Like I said, this was like 10, 15 guys, his most trusted individuals, made up of, again, more middle-class folks, lesser land-owning class citizens, whose education was in law to run the national level businesses of England at this time. The Royal Council handled any business the king put before it, to include real or potential aristocratic threats. So kind of like the king's right-hand men. The Court of Star Chamber, called that because of the stars that were painted on the ceiling, applied principles of Roman law, and its methods were sometimes terrifying and ruthless. This was not necessarily a just court. If you were a noble accused of something, you did not have to see evidence against you. These sessions were closed door. They were private. Torture could be applied to extract confessions. Juries were not called. So this is not the type of place that you want to find yourself. England had no standing army or professional civil service bureaucracy. The Tudors relied on support of unpaid local officials and justices of the peace, which were people who handled things at the local government level. These were your sheriffs, your judges, your tax collectors at the local level throughout the kingdom. And I suppose they could have gotten away with not having a standing army because why? Why do you think? They're on an island, right? So they can get away with it a little bit more than, say, France can. So that's how the monarchy came to more power in England. In Spain, things are going to stay a little bit more divided. While England and France laid the foundation of unified nation-states, Spain remained a conglomerate of independent kingdoms. The Reconquista, wars of northern Christian kingdoms to control the entire peninsula, especially against the Moors and the Muslims in Grenada, had many military and religious objectives. Conversion or expulsion of the Muslims and Jews, and political control of the South. And if you guys want to, I think it's coming up in the slides, but if you look in your book on page 437, there's a nice map that shows how Spain was broken up, or the Iberian Peninsula, I should say. By the middle of the 15th century, the kingdoms of Castile and Aragon dominated the weaker Navarre, Portugal, and Grenada, and the Iberian Peninsula. Even the wedding of Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon did not bring about unity, however. To curb the rebellious and warring aristocracy, Ferdinand and Isabella revived an old medieval institution, the Hermandades, or the Brotherhood is what they were called, which were popular groups in towns given authority to act as local police forces and judicial tribunes. So not a bad thing and not so different than what England did, except when they did repress violence, it was so awful that they didn't last very long. By 1498, they were disbanded because they were taking things a little too far. Yeah, kind of. I mean, not much different than the Justices of Peace. I mean, the Justices of Peace effectively did the same thing, right? Landowners handling all the work of the local government. Again, the local government at the local level. In England, they had the Justices of Peace. In Spain, they had the Hermandades. Except the Hermandades took things too far. Right? These are guys at the local level handling business. Make sense? More than just a neighborhood watch, though, because they are given authority from Isabella and Ferdinand to carry out these acts, to implement justice. The decisive step that Ferdinand and Isabella took to curb aristocratic power was the restructuring of the Royal Council. which excluded the aristocrats, kicked them out. It was supposed to handle all executive, judicial, and legislative issues, as well as responsible for supervision of local authorities. So instead of the Hermandades. King and Queen therefore appoint only people of the middle class background to the council. So we see this again. Same thing that we saw in France and to some extent in England. In the expansion of royal authority and the consolidation of territories in Spain, the church was the linchpin. Spain is typically super Catholic, and that's going to be an issue in the reunification. If the Spanish crown could select the higher clergy, the monarchy could influence church policy, wealth, and military resources, not unlike what happened in France and not unlike what happened in England. So through an alliance with the Spanish Pope Alexander VI, the Spanish monarch secured the right to appoint bishops in Spain, and revenues from the church provided the means to raise an army to continue the Reconquista, to conquer all of the Iberian Peninsula. January 6, 1492, Isabella went into Granada, which is in the very south, as you can see in your map. They fought against the Arabs in southern Spain, and the conclusion of the Reconquista when they took Granada from the Arabs. And there's the map on the screen. There still remained a sizable and, in the view of the majority of the Spanish population, a potentially dangerous minority in Spain, and that is that of the Jews. For some reason, the Jews have been fought, beat up, hated. People have been prejudiced to them forever. Prior to the Spanish Inquisition, they were kicked out of England. They were kicked out of France. A lot of them went to Spain because they weren't being terrorized there. The Holocaust is not the first time that the Jews were attacked, right? Pretty much since the beginning of time. Okay, so there was a strong undertone of resentment of Jewish influence and wealth surfaced, the feeling of resentment. Jews that came to Spain were educated. They were typically wealthy. They were good with their money. They gave out loans, and people resented them. For whatever reason, they're always a scapegoat when it comes to bad economic times. When the kings of France and England expelled the Jews from their kingdom, many sought refuge in Spain, like I mentioned. But diversity, as we would see it now in America, was not a medieval social ideal. We did not accept people that were not different, or did not accept people that were different. So in the 14th century, anti-Semitism in Spain rose up, and aggravated by anti-Jewish preaching, economic dislocation, and a search for a scapegoat during the Black Death, the Jews got blamed for a lot. One scholar estimated that 40% of the Jewish population of Spain was killed or forced to convert during the Spanish Inquisition. Those converted were called conversos, or new Christians. Again, as I mentioned, not that they were, because they were a converso, they were well educated and successful, but Jews were typically well educated and successful before they became converted Christians. They also held royal secretaryship, controlled the royal treasury, composed a third of royal council, held high positions as archbishops, bishops, and abbots, and held the highest public offices because they were well educated. But again, previously being Jewish and being educated and being given these high points and these high offices, if you will, in the government or in the clergy, there is more resentment, and the aristocracy is going to resent them. The poor hated converso tax collectors. Churchmen doubted the sincerity of their conversions, so eventually they're going to come out and say that you being able to convert isn't even a possibility because being a Jew is in your blood. and that you will never actually be able to completely convert. So they went on an all-out inquisition of the Jews in Spain. Pope Sixtus IV authorized in 1478 an inquisition giving permission to Ferdinand and Isabella to establish tribunals to, quote-unquote, search out and punish converts from Judaism who had transgressed against Christianity by secretly adhering to Jewish beliefs and performing rites of the Jews. So basically they came out and said, these guys didn't actually convert, they just said they did, so we didn't kill them or kick them out of the country, and they're still practicing Judaism on their own time behind closed doors. So there was a big inquisition where they rallied up a bunch of Jews and as the term inquisition suggests, questioned them. So again, as I mentioned, the person's status as a Jew could not be changed by religious conversion because it was who they were as a human. It was in their blood. So they came up with what was called as purity of blood laws. Having pure Christian blood became a requirement for noble status, which, as we talked about on the previous slide, a bunch of the conversos were. The new racially based anti-Semitism emerged at the very time a Spanish national feeling was emerging, a national sentiment that looked to the building of a single nation. Jews therefore represented a great threat to national unity for whatever reason they thought that. Although the Inquisition was a religious institution, it was controlled by the crown and served primarily as a politically unifying tool. Not much different than what Hitler did, right? If we are all oppressed or if something is going bad, it's a lot easier to rally people together if we have a common enemy. And that's what they did with the Jews, just like what Hitler did with the Jews. Shortly after the conquest of the Moorish stronghold at Grenada in 1492, which is in the very south of the Iberian Peninsula, Isabella and Ferdinand issued an edict expelling all practicing Jews from Spain. And a whole bunch of them fled. Pretty much all of them left Spain. Okay, so that is the Spanish Inquisition. Pretty short section. So trace the evolution of nation-states of Western Europe during this period. How did the nation-states of Western Europe evolve in this period? So how did they evolve? What's the main thing that went on? Huh? Less power to the aristocracy, more power to what? Okay, more importantly though, who's really getting the power here? The monarchy. Don't lose sight of that. That's what all of this is about, is the monarchy getting more power, right? They don't care at all about the middle class having power. They're not giving rights to the middle class because they think that it's more fair and they feel bad for them for being oppressed by the nobles. That's not it. They're doing it to take power away from the nobles. Got it?